Hello, thanks for stopping by, and welcome to this third and final instalment in our look at the history of the Glasgow Subway. In the previous two videos, which I'll link below in case you missed them, we saw how the subway was planned and built in the late 19th century, along with the unfortunate series of events that occurred on its opening day back in December 1896. It's now time to examine the system itself in a bit more detail. We'll begin by looking at the early rolling stock, original station designs and so on that characterised the subway between 1896 and 1977, before moving on to learn about the revamped subway which reopened to the public in 1980 following a massive overhaul. As you're going to see, these two incarnations, which between them have served Glasgow for some 125 years, are very different systems indeed. Anyway, without any further ado, hop on board and let's get going.
The next stop is Dublin. Please make the gap with the lighting.
The Glasgow Subway runs on a 4-foot gauge track, and through tunnels which are 11 foot wide. This makes it somewhat smaller in size when compared to other underground networks, and its trains have a uniquely dinky feel. The first carriages, or cars as they're called in the Glasgow Subway, were built in Birmingham by the Oldbury Carriage and Wagon Company, who had later gone to become part of Metro Camel. These early cars had wooden bodies, which were painted in a plum and cream coloured livery, and smart interiors, complete with decorative glass panels. The lovely old example shown here is an original 1896 car. You can see it in Glasgow's excellent Riverside Museum, details of which I'll leave in the description. Each car was designed to hold 42 people, and they had wooden seats that were fixed to the walls rather than the floor. When travelling, this made them rock from side to side, or shugle as the Glaswegians say. As each station approached, the train's guard would call out the name, and upon arrival, he'd control exit and entry with the car's American-style sliding gates. I say he because in those days, although women were employed in the system's ticketing kiosks, they were strictly forbidden to work on the trains themselves. This attitude was crystallised in March 1916 when a tribunal grilled the company's manager over his insistence that the subway's male staff should be excused from military service, a situation of course that would have required women to take on the roles of drivers and guards. The main reason the manager gave was that he considered the subway to be too dangerous an environment for females to work in. Supposing there was a breakdown, it was reported as saying, the women employees would have to alight and guide the passengers through the tunnel. As we've seen in previous videos, the Glasgow Subway began life as a cable-hauled railway. To control trains running on this system, drivers used a brake and a gripper device, which can be seen here. To move the train, the gripper was simply latched on and off the continuously moving cable as required. Despite being cable-hauled, the subway cars were lit by electricity, the power being provided by a pickup arm fixed to the side of the car. Before it was modernised in the late 1970s, which we'll come to later, the Glasgow Subway looked very different to the one that serves the city today. In its first incarnation, every station had island-style platforms, with the inner and outer circle lines running on either side. This configuration can still be seen at many stations, although some platforms, such as those at St Enoch, Govan and Partick, have since been remodelled. Because of this layout, the subway's early cars only required sets of doors on one side, and this was incorporated into their design. To even out wear and tear, each unit would be rotated to run on the opposite line every 10 days. Tickets for the subway were purchased via cinema-style kiosks in the station's entrance hall, although vending machines were trialled at some stations, such as the one shown in this image, which was taken at Hillhead Station in 1962. Down below, meanwhile, the phrase "queue here," along with a directional arrow, was painted on each platform to encourage speedy boarding. Now, this will sound strange to those who are familiar with the subway today, but believe it or not, a number of the shallower stations, such as Copeland Road, Cessnock and Kinning Park, used to have glass roofs. Whilst good for providing natural light, this more open nature sometimes enabled smog to seep into the system, which unsurprisingly caused problems. Most notably in December 1920, when a thick fog in the tunnel caused two trains to collide just south of St Enoch Station, causing one passenger to break her ankle. Something else that leaked into a certain part of the system was the strong smell of fish. This happened often around West Street Station, thanks to a fishmonger's that stood right next door. Whenever a batch of fish was being smoked, the subway staff were the first to know about it. West Street has always been the least used station on the Glasgow Subway, so much so that staff used to call it the Boneyard. I'm not sure if this nickname is still in use today though. If you know, please let me know in the comments. Going back to curious pongs, I think it's at this point I should mention the Glasgow Subway's legendary aroma. Although I've noticed a slight earthy whiff whenever I've travelled on the subway, this smell, which is surprisingly rather pleasant, was apparently much stronger before modernisation. It's most likely evolved over time too, as in its earliest days it said the grease used on the long haulage cables was a contributing factor. If you're lucky enough to have experienced the subway pre-1977, I'd be fascinated to hear your thoughts and memories regarding this unique fragrance. Located opposite Govan Station, Broomloan Depot has taken care of the subway's rolling stock since the very beginning. In the old days, this was a rather tricky task, as the subway was entirely underground with no direct link to the surface. Because of this, cars requiring maintenance had to be hoisted in and out of the tunnels using a 22.5 tonne crane that was housed within the depot's main shed. The lifting pit to accommodate this task was located around the subway's main tracks, meaning trains in regular service would rumble through the space below the depot every few minutes. When the system closed for the night, trains would also be stabled around this area. Broomloan Depot continues to service the Glasgow Subway today, and procedures are now a lot more efficient thanks to a tunnel that was built to connect the system to the surface in the 1970s, thus making it far easier to bring cars above ground. When travelling on the subway, you can clearly see the area beneath the depot, which is wide and well lit, when passing between Govan and Ibrox. Despite its initial popularity, the subway was facing severe financial woes by the early 1920s, and in February 1922, it was reported that those with shares in the company hadn't received a dividend for over 10 years. Consequently, the subway was closed until further notice. Sadly, it was during this period, in May 1922, that Alexander Simpson, who'd done so much to plan and build the system in the late 19th century, passed away. He lived to the grand old age of 91 and was buried in Glasgow's Cathcart Cemetery. After intense negotiations, the subway was finally saved when it was purchased by the Glasgow Corporation in July 1922. This made it a municipal concern, and a ceremony was held to celebrate the subway's reopening, which involved the Lord Provost of Glasgow, Sir Thomas Paxton, being given a spin on the line in a specially decorated car. Following this change of hands, the subway cars were rebranded in a red and cream livery, which would later change to red all over. I'm only guessing here, but I assume this was to bring the system more in line with the city's trams, which before World War II were decked out in similar shades. Although the idea of switching the subway from cable to electric traction had been discussed many times over the years, no attempt had been made to do so due to the aforementioned financial stresses, and the system continued to be cable hauled, with new sets of ropes being ordered every few years, each of which were installed via the sidings behind the Scotland Street power station. These hefty cables were still very pricey though, and so in March 1933, the corporation began to seriously consider electrification. This led to a portion of the line between Merkland Street and Copeland Road being electrified in an experimental capacity, and on Sunday the 26th of March, a test train successfully ran along this section. Consequently, the corporation voted overwhelmingly in the following month to electrify the entire system, although one dissenter, a Mr. J. Taylor, who witnessed the experiment in March, piped up to say, "I want to be frank and say that nothing I saw that morning convinced me that the suggestion made is going to make a considerable improvement in the subway." I think we can safely now say he was wrong on that one. Work to electrify the system was carried out at night, with one line converted at a time. This meant that for a short period, one side of the system was fully electric, whilst the other continued to be hauled by cable. No new rolling stock were ordered for the change. Instead, the old 1890s cable gripper cars were simply adapted to run on electricity. It was also around this time that the cars were kitted out with smart new leather seats, which, despite the makeover, continued to shogle Glaswegian commuters. The final cost of electrification totaled £110,000, which is roughly £8 million in today's money, and the switchover was finally completed in the autumn of 1935. The very last cable hauled service was driven towards Broomloan depot on the 30th of November by Robert Boyd, who, rather fittingly, was the son of the man who'd taken charge of the very first train back in December 1896. More changes were to come in 1936, when the corporation decided to rename the system the Glasgow Underground. Although to keep things simple for this video, I'm going to stick with Subway. As the Second World War approached, the glass roofs of stations such as Copeland Road and Cessnock were painted black. This of course was part of the citywide blackout precautions, and it no doubt transformed these stations into rather gloomy places. In the early days of the war, there was some debate as to whether or not the Glasgow Subway could be used to shelter people during air raids, as was the case on London's Underground. The idea was dismissed though, as the tunnels were deemed mostly too shallow to provide adequate protection. This scepticism was proven right on the night of the 18th of September 1940, when a bomb exploded close to Merkland Street Station, severely damaging both the inner and outer circle tunnels. Incredibly, no one was hurt, although the system had to close for some time whilst reconstruction work was carried out. If you know where to look today, you can just about spot the repaired section flash past when travelling between Partick and Govan. The site of the blast is marked by a distinctive brick section in the tunnel's wall. Another shocking incident to occur during the 1940s wasn't war-related, it was a murder. This crime took place in March 1943, when a 35-year-old dock labourer named Henry Duffus was stabbed on a train as it sped between Bridge Street and Shields Road. At Shields Road station, Henry managed to stagger up to the entrance, but he collapsed and died on his way to hospital. A man named Peter Kelly was charged with his murder. By the 1970s, the Glasgow Subway was beginning to look pretty run down. The old Victorian cars, which by this point had covered several million miles each, were still soldiering on, although in some cases they were now relying on parts cannibalised from the city's old tram network, which had ceased operating in 1962. The stations themselves, meanwhile, had become very grubby affairs indeed. A report in the late 1960s had already looked into options for the subway's potential future, one of which suggested closing the system altogether. Fortunately, modernisation was also on the table, and this was the favoured choice. In May 1977, therefore, Glaswegians bid a fond farewell to their old Victorian subway as it closed its doors to allow the work to commence. The modernisation project was a massive undertaking. Almost all of the original station entrances were demolished, with only Kelvinhall, Hillhead, Cessnock and St Enoch surviving. When it came to modernisation, one station was already ahead of the game, and that was St George's Cross, which had had its entrance updated in the early 1970s as part of a major road widening scheme. If you'd like a flavour of the subway's old architecture, a good place to head is Cessnock, where the ornate vintage signage has been maintained outside. An echo of Kelvin Bridge's old entrance can still be seen too. The site of this fire exit, just across from the modern building, marks the spot. St Enoch's original building, meanwhile, was converted into a travel information centre, although it's since become a coffee shop, with a new entrance to the platforms located nearby. During the works, this grand old structure had to be jacked up above the construction site on a platform. An extremely impressive feat of engineering, I think you'll agree. Down below, meanwhile, every station interior was completely refurbished with smart tiles and a distinctive colour scheme that was very much of its era. And platforms that had once had skylight windows were completely sealed in, giving them a much more subterranean feel. The biggest change took place at Merkland Street, where the old station was completely abandoned and replaced by Partick, which stands a short distance away and was designed to provide a large, modern interchange with National Rail services. Today, no trace of Merkland Street remains on the surface, although if you're travelling below ground, the location can be identified by a chamber-like area which briefly opens up in a tunnel just south of Partick. Partick Station also features one of the Glasgow Subway's quirkiest gems, the G.I. Bride statue, which is a tribute to the artist Bud Nill, who was born nearby in 1911 and went on to become one of Scotland's most popular cartoonists. A number of other stations were also renamed during the modernisation. Govan Cross became Govan, Copeland Road became Ibrox, and Partick Cross became Kelvinhall. Another big innovation was at Buchanan Street, where a moving walkway was installed to provide a link with Queen Street, the main line terminal from where you can catch trains to places such as Edinburgh and the Highlands. Queen Street Station itself underwent modernisation between 2017 and 2020, and is now a very smart looking building indeed. For many years, Buchanan Street subway station was also home to one of the old Victorian subway cars, which was mounted as a wall display. A number of other vintage cars were also kept to serve as museum pieces, although sadly most of the faithful old rolling stock ended up being scrapped by Arnott's young shipbreakers, who were based in Dalmuir. Like the very first cars, the new trains destined for the new-look Glasgow Subway were built in Birmingham, this time by Metro Camel. They were designed in conjunction with the Glasgow School of Art, and mock-ups, as shown in this archive footage, were displayed to the public before the modernisation process commenced. Initially, the new rolling stock were painted bright orange, leading some to nickname the new system the Clockwork Orange.
I mean, this is going to be the original Clockwork Orange.
However, you may be surprised to learn that this term is seldom used by Glaswegians themselves. Later liveries used on the second generation rolling stock include a darker shade of orange, known as Strathclyde Red, a cream and carmine design, and in more recent years a smart grey, white and orange look, as well as a special design celebrating the Subway's 120th anniversary in 2016. There's been a few brief promotional liveries too, such as this splendid Andy Warhol-esque Grabby Burns design from 2009. The Modernization cost £53 million, which is about £233 million in today's money, and took 3 years to complete, which is pretty impressive considering how drastically the system changed. The shiny new Glasgow Subway was formally opened by the Queen on the 1st of November 1979, although the need for some last-minute alterations meant the subway did not begin carrying passengers until the 16th of April 1980. Despite the name change way back in 1936, most Glaswegians had continued to refer to their system as the Subway, and in 2003 the Glasgow Underground branding was dropped and officially switched back to this more traditional title. In recent years, the late 1970s and early 80s look that had defined the Subway's second incarnation for several decades was itself beginning to look rather dated, although personally I rather like this retro style. Consequently, this has led to considerable cosmetic work being carried out across the system. In line with this sprucing up, the next chapter in the history of the Glasgow Subway is soon due to be marked with the introduction of the third generation rolling stock, which will feature driverless operation. I wonder what those fellows who dug the tunnels by candlelight all those years ago would have made of Glasgow's 21st century subway. Thanks so much for watching. I really hope you've enjoyed this delve into the history of the Glasgow Subway. I would love to hear your thoughts on the system. Do you prefer the subway in its pre or post 1977 form? Can you describe its distinctive smell? What do you think of the recent facelift? And perhaps most importantly, have you ever attempted that infamous testament to drinking, the Glasgow Sub Crawl? As ever, I'd like to express my sincerest gratitude to all of you who support this channel. I simply cannot thank you enough for your kind words, likes and shares. They really do spur me on. If you haven't yet subscribed to Rob's London, I'd appreciate it very much if you could please consider doing so, as this will ensure you don't miss out on any future videos, as well as helping the channel to grow. And don't forget, if you're after a Glasgow Subway related gift, or if you just want to treat yourself, I've designed a series of hand-drawn mugs featuring the system's various rolling stock and station names. They're available from my Etsy store, Rob's Online Designs, which I'll link in the description. Anyway, thank you again friends, stay well and please be sure to stay tuned.